No act of courage comes without vulnerability. This seemingly paradoxical statement opens up the entire spirit of Brené Brown's book. She doesn't write about the strength of the invulnerable, but about the courage of those who tremble. This book doesn't teach leadership through power, but through the heart, where people dare to show up, dare to speak truthfully, dare to be vulnerable, and still keep moving forward. In today's world, leadership is no longer a title for those at the top, but a challenge for everyone trying to live wholeheartedly amidst chaos. This book touches upon a core question: how do we maintain kindness amidst the struggles for survival? How do we stand firm without becoming cold, strong without losing our humanity? This is the journey of wholehearted leadership. A journey full of paradoxes where weakness becomes the source of strength, where daring to admit fear is the very beginning of trust. Because in every organization, every relationship, trust doesn't arise from flowery speeches, but from small actions. An apology, admitting a mistake, a heartfelt conversation. The courage Brené Brown speaks of isn't about defeating others, but about conquering the fear within ourselves. Fear of judgment, fear of hurt, fear of not being good enough. Courage, in its deepest sense, isn't about hiding fear, but about carrying it with you and still acting. Perhaps the most important question this book poses isn't how to lead, but how to remain human in a leadership role. When every formula for success calls for control, she gently asks, if we can't control the outcome, do we dare to be authentic in the process? This book is for those who are tired of wearing masks, for those who still believe that kindness is not weakness, and for those who are quietly learning to get back up after being wounded. Because sometimes the most courageous thing isn't to step onto the podium of glory, but to dare to stand still in a crowd and admit, I'm scared, but I'm still here. When we are brave enough to show up in the world, vulnerability is inevitable. It is not the enemy of courage, but the birthplace of courage. Throughout 20 years of research, I've observed an irreversible rule: if we dare to step into the arena, we will fall. But that very fall proves that we are truly living, truly present. No one becomes courageous by avoiding what frightens them. We only become courageous when we venture into the unknown, where no one guarantees we will win, but where we will surely understand who we are. I once thought there might be a shortcut to avoid the feeling of insecurity and trembling when standing before thousands of people. But there isn't. Every time I speak in a crowd, every time I talk about what I believe, I feel my fragility emerge like a thin layer of ice. It's that layer, not rigidity, that connects us to others. Vulnerability is not weakness. It is the first condition for courage. Many people ask me, how do I trust myself in a world full of judgment? I always remember Theodore Roosevelt's words in The Man in the Arena speech. It is not the critic who counts, but rather the one who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. They are the ones who fail, stumble, and then get back up, because they understand that only those who dare to act truly know the value of life. When I first read that, I realized that all my fears, all the criticisms I had ever received, were less important than continuing to show up and speak what I believed to be true. In today's world, we are easily swept up in the noise from the cheap seats, where people who never dare to try expend all their energy judging those who are acting. I call them the spectators of cynicism. They sit far away, hurling bitter words as if they themselves are fighting. But they are not in the arena. If someone isn't willing to share our vulnerability, isn't willing to step in with us, then their opinion doesn't deserve a place in our hearts. I learned to be selective, keeping only a few truly important people, those willing to speak the truth, even when it's hard to hear. I call them the small squares, those whose names fit on the tiniest piece of paper you can keep in your wallet, symbolizing the few truly trustworthy voices. We often believe we can control life by eliminating risks, by planning everything in advance. But that also means we are eliminating opportunities for growth. I've met many engineers who say they can't afford to be vulnerable because they work in a field where errors must be eliminated. I understand them. But then they confess that the hardest part isn't keeping a satellite in orbit, but leading people and facing difficult conversations. An engineer once told me he felt awkward having to evaluate underperforming employees because he was afraid of hurting them. I told him that this hesitation is precisely what makes things worse. No algorithm can help us avoid emotions, And if we try to engineer emotions, we are abandoning the human part of ourselves. Some also say, I don't do that vulnerable stuff. They believe that by hiding their emotions, they will be safe. But in reality, everyone is vulnerable. Some choose to face it, others deny it. We can choose to let vulnerability control us or choose to learn to live with it. When we deny it, fear drives every decision. When we acknowledge it, we can move forward with autonomy. I once worked with a group of Special Forces soldiers. When I asked them if there was any example of courage that didn't require vulnerability, the room fell silent. One man stood up and said, "No, ma'am. In 3 tour of duty, I have never seen a courageous act that didn't come with their own fear." These men, who seemed the strongest, understood most deeply that courage isn't the absence of fear, but walking through fear. One of the most dangerous myths is the belief that we can go it alone. Our culture celebrates independence, but human biology does not. We are wired to connect, to need each other. Prolonged separation turns into isolation, and isolation kills trust. No matter how talented we are, we still need others to reflect ourselves, to know where we are going. Some also think we must have trust first before we dare to be vulnerable, but trust doesn't just appear. It's built by small actions, one by one, like marbles falling into a glass jar. A child trusts you when you remember their grandparents' names, when you share half your seat with them in the cafeteria. These small, repeated gestures create what I call the marble jar of trust. Trust isn't formed from grand promises, but from small things kept. And finally, some think that vulnerability means oversharing. But the truth is not in the quantity of sharing, but in our intention. When we speak truthfully to connect, that is courage. When we speak only to gain attention or pity, that is manipulation. Between these two is a thin line requiring mindfulness. I met a young investor who had just raised capital for his company. He said, "I'm going to be honest with everyone. I'm terrified. I don't know what I'm doing." I looked at him and said, "Honesty is good, but be careful. Courage isn't about exposing everything, but about knowing what needs to be shared to serve the common goal. Vulnerability isn't about pouring everything out, but about opening up just enough to connect. When we dare to speak about our fears, our shame, or our fragility, we create space for others to do the same. And it is in that space that trust begins to blossom. The most successful organizations, teams, and families I've seen all have one thing in common. They know how to talk about difficult things without using it to hurt each other. Vulnerability is never a weakness. It is the heartbeat of courage, the breath of creativity, the ground where all true relationships are formed. When we dare to step into the blurred zone of uncertainty, when we dare to say, "I don't know," we open up the possibility of learning. And in the moment we open our hearts, the world opens back to us. We can spend a lifetime building fences, but just one act of honesty is enough to change how we see ourselves. In a world that constantly demands us to be strong, daring to say, "I'm scared," can sometimes be the strongest act. It is there that we truly begin to rumble, not fighting with others, but with the fear within ourselves. And when we realize that every effort to avoid vulnerability only leads to isolation, we begin to choose a different path. The path of connection, of curiosity, of daring to show up even with a trembling heart, because that is where our true selves are born. I used to believe that as we grew older, fear would simply vanish, that experience and knowledge would shield us from that raw feeling. But no, fear never leaves. It merely changes form, becoming more subtle, sometimes taking on the guise of logic, expertise, or power. That is the armor we wear every day, an invisible shell that makes us think we are strong, but actually isolates us from our true selves. This armor comes in many forms. Some wear the armor of know-it-all, always having to be right, knowing everything, having the last word in every meeting. They fear silence because silence means others might see that they don't know. I used to be like that. I thought if I stayed silent, everyone would realize I wasn't good enough. But the truth is, the more we try to appear all-knowing, the more we make those around us feel unheard. In an organization, that kills creativity. No one dares to speak the truth when they know the leader is always right. Curiosity, not knowledge, is the foundation of learning. I know must yield to, I want to understand. Another type of armor is sarcasm and cynicism. That's when we turn everything into a joke to avoid real emotions. A manager once told me he often used sarcasm to reduce tension in his team. But actually, every sarcastic remark is a small knife cutting into others' trust. When leaders use sarcasm as a tool, they are sending the message that emotions have no place here, but trust cannot exist where emotions are forbidden. The antidote to sarcasm is clarity, kindness, and hope. There are also those who wear the armor of perfectionism. They believe that if they do everything perfectly, they will never be hurt. But perfectionism is not the pursuit of excellence, it is the fear of judgment dressed as ambition. We try our best so that no one can criticize us, but in that process, we paralyze ourselves. Perfectionists are often exhausted because they never feel enough. In fact, courage doesn't lie in doing everything perfectly, but in daring to do it even knowing you might fail. Perfection is a wall of fear, while effort is the gateway to creativity. I once met a woman who worked in investment banking in London. She said she couldn't show emotions at work for fear of being seen as weak. She called it professionalism, but every time she held back tears when a colleague was fired, every time she pretended to be calm after a failed deal, she felt a part of herself die. When I asked, "How do you feel about showing compassion at work?" She was silent for a long time, then whispered, "I've forgotten what that feels like." The armor of coldness doesn't protect us from pain, it only prevents us from feeling joy. Another common armor is the fear of being wrong. In performance-driven organizations, people fear making mistakes more than they fear not learning anything. When the most important thing is don't be wrong, no one dares to try, no one dares to create. I've seen talented teams turn into safe, repetitive machines just because they feared failure. But failure is not proof of incompetence, it is proof of effort. We cannot learn without making mistakes, just as we cannot love without sometimes being hurt. When I worked with military leadership teams, they spoke of the armor of honor, the toughness they had to maintain to survive in harsh environments. They believed that only by hiding their emotions could they protect themselves and their comrades. But an old officer told me something I will never forget. The armor that kept me alive on the battlefield kills me when I come home. When we don't dare to take off our armor, we also cannot embrace anyone. And then we become prisoners of the very strength we created. There is no courageous act that does not come with vulnerability. Whether it's saying, "I'm sorry," making a difficult decision, or daring to take responsibility, we must step into the empty space of uncertainty. There, no one is sure of the outcome, but it is precisely that moment that distinguishes those who truly live from those who merely exist. Those who dare to live in that space, despite fear, despite feeling lost, are the ones who are truly leading, not by title, but by humanity. I once asked an executive who had experienced many crises, "What is the hardest thing about leadership?" He replied, "Knowing that everyone is looking to me for certainty, while I myself am confused." That answer made me understand that courage is not having all the answers, but daring to step forward when you have no certainty. A leader is not chosen between fear or courage, but only between courage or avoidance. In every piece of armor we wear, there is an old story of fear, of shame, of times we were hurt and swore we would never let it happen again. But then we grow up, carrying those vows into our workplaces, our loves, our friendships. We believe we are protecting ourselves, but in reality, we are only preventing ourselves from experiencing life fully. Taking off the armor doesn't mean becoming weak, but accepting that true strength comes from the ability to feel. I remember once standing before a group of young leaders and saying, "If you want to build a culture of courage, start by learning to say, 'I don't know.'" The room went silent. Then a woman asked, "But if I say that, will they still trust me?" I replied, "If you don't say that, will they trust you?" Because trust is built not on omniscience, but on authenticity. We are all taught that to survive, we must hide our inner truth, but to lead, we must do the opposite. The world doesn't need more perfect people. It needs people who dare to show up, even when incomplete. When we dare to take off our armor, we don't become weaker. We simply return to being human. And it is in that moment that courage finds its form. There is a silent emotion that is deeply rooted in every human being. Shame. It's not as loud as anger, not as easily recognized as fear. It's quiet, but it can suffocate the heart and make us withdraw. Shame doesn't say, "I did something wrong, but I am wrong." It doesn't criticize an action, but attacks our very being. When we believe we are unworthy of love, not good enough to be respected, that's when shame is controlling us. In the workplace, shame is a silent destroyer. I've observed meetings where employees were humiliated in front of colleagues. Some stayed silent, some forced a laugh, but all remembered. From then on, they didn't dare to be creative, didn't dare to speak differently, didn't dare to take risks. No creative culture can exist where shame is a leadership tool. Conversely, where there is empathy, there is vitality. I often say empathy is the antidote to shame. But empathy is not sweet consolation or a few, everything will be all right, phrases. Empathy is when we dare to sit down, put aside judgment, to understand what the other person is feeling. It is the act of one who knows how to listen, not one who knows how to speak. A friend came to me, voice trembling from being denied a promotion. If I had said, "Come on, at least you still have a job," I would be denying their feelings. But if I said, "I understand that must hurt immensely because you poured your heart into it," I would be stepping in with them instead of standing outside judging. Empathy doesn't require solutions, it only requires presence. Over many years of teaching, I've realized that most people are not taught how to name their emotions. When we can't name it, we can't control it. Shame, therefore, spreads like darkness. We often hide it with anger, with silence, with laughter. But when we dare to name it, "I'm feeling shame," we reclaim power, like lighting a lamp in a dark room. The light doesn't instantly dispel the pain, but it helps us see more clearly where we are. I remember a soldier once saying, "I was trained to endure everything except shame." He recounted that in his worst days, he didn't fear bullets, only the disappointed look of his commanding officer. When shame is not named, it turns into fear, then into anger, then into distance. But when someone is willing to sit with you, not trying to fix, just listening, shame loses its power. We don't need to be rescued from shame, we need to be understood within it. I teach leaders that if they want to build trust, they must first learn to show empathy. Ask more, assume less. Let others define their experience. Don't claim that right. Once employees believe they can speak truthfully without being humiliated, the organization begins to change. But if every mistake is labeled useless, people will learn to hide mistakes rather than correct them. And when pretense becomes the norm, true competence is buried. Trust is the lifeblood of every team. It is not built with slogans, but with small, repeated gestures. Keeping promises, not talking behind people's backs, admitting mistakes, not exploiting others' information. I call these the marbles in the jar of trust. Every sincere action is a marble added, and every betrayal, every act of carelessness, is a marble falling out. When the jar is empty, no relationship can stand. Some think trust is something emotional, but research shows it is a measurable structure. I summarize it with 7 elements: boundaries, reliability, accountability, vault, confidentiality, integrity, non-judgment, and generosity. If one of these elements is broken, the entire structure collapses. A friend who doesn't keep your secret even once makes you unable to open up as before. A boss who doesn't dare to admit their own mistakes makes employees afraid to admit theirs. Trust needs to be nurtured every day with small actions that we might think no one notices. Then there's something else I always emphasize. Curiosity is the gateway to courage. When we are curious, we temporarily set aside our "I know everything" ego and open ourselves to learning. Curiosity makes us listen instead of reacting, ask instead of concluding. In organizations that dare to encourage curiosity, people aren't afraid to say, "I don't know." They see it as the beginning of learning, not proof of weakness. I once witnessed a group of engineers solve a system crisis by asking, "What is actually happening?" instead of "Who caused this?" The first question leads to discovery. The second only leads to defensiveness. When we cultivate curiosity, we gradually develop what I call rooted confidence. This is not the proud head held high of someone who is always right, but the serenity of someone who knows it's okay to be wrong as long as something is learned. Rooted confidence doesn't need to be flashy because it doesn't come from proving, but from understanding who you are. In sports, they call it muscle memory. Good players don't have to think about every step because they've practiced to the point where their body does it automatically. In leadership, it's the same. When we practice facing vulnerability, practice empathy, practice curiosity, they become reflexes. Under pressure, we no longer try to hide but know how to open up. Amidst mistakes, we don't rush to blame but seek to understand. Courage is no longer an impulse but becomes a habit. One day, perhaps we will look back and realize that every turning point in life began with a moment when we dared to be vulnerable. When we dared to apologize, dared to admit we didn't know, dared to step out of our comfort zone to trust someone. Our inner world began to shift. And when we change, the world around us changes too. No one teaches us courage as a skill, but we can learn it like learning to breathe. Every time we choose connection instead of avoidance, choose to listen instead of judge, choose to show up instead of retreat, we are training the muscles of courage. And over time, it becomes a natural part of us, like our heartbeat, like our breath. When we live like this, we don't need to say we are leaders. People will feel it. Because true leadership doesn't come from a title, but from the ability to touch the hearts of others, making them feel safe to also venture forth. That is the moment when vulnerability and courage merge into one, and people rediscover their primal nature, daring to be fully present in this life with their whole heart. People often believe they know what they believe, that their core values are immutable, as firm as the rock beneath their feet. But it only takes one difficult decision, one moment of weakness, or one heated meeting to realize that values are not in words. They live in actions, and often in moments no one sees. We find it easy to talk about values, but hard to truly live by them. I used to be like that, believing I was acting correctly, until the smallest choices reflected back what I was trying to deny. Sometimes I chose comfort over courage. When values are no longer just slogans, everything begins to change. In organizations I've worked with, plaques emblazoned with respect, integrity, innovation remained on the walls, while actual behavior contradicted every word. Not everyone intentionally acts falsely. They just haven't learned how to translate those ideals into concrete actions. Without a common language for values, people easily get lost in a gray area where everyone assumes they are right. A leader once told me, "We talk about trust every day, but we don't know what it means to be trustworthy." That statement made me realize that talking about values without operationalizing them is like talking about a map but never stepping onto the road. Living into our values means turning values into something measurable, visible, and tangible. It's no longer an ideal, but a choice. When we say, "I value honesty," the next question must be, how do I demonstrate that through my actions? No one can live by all values at once. We must choose, and that choice reveals who we are more than any self-introduction. In my research, I always encourage people to choose 2 core values, because only by narrowing them down do we truly commit ourselves to living by them every day. I remember a manager who chose fairness and courage. She wrote down 3 behaviors that demonstrated those 2 values: listening before judging, speaking the truth even when it's hard to hear, and not using power to evade responsibility. Then she added 3 slippery behaviors that would pull her away from those values: interrupting others, avoiding conflict, and gossiping to relieve stress. When she finished, she was silent for a long time, then said, "I realized I'm living mostly in the latter half." That's when the process of living by values truly begins, when we are courageous enough to see our own inconsistencies. We deviate from core values not out of malice, but out of fear of upsetting others and avoiding conflict in the workplace. That fear turns into collective safety, where everyone stays silent to maintain harmony. But silence has a price. Creativity dies, trust erodes, and the most courageous people leave first. We call that a nice culture, but in reality, it's fear wrapped in politeness. When I worked with a tech team, they said they valued people. But in meetings, only a few familiar voices resonated. The rest remained silent. I asked, "Do you think silence is also feedback?" One person replied, "We're silent because we don't want to cause trouble." I said, "But that very silence is betraying your value of respect, because respect is not agreement. It's listening to each other." The room fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of awareness. When living by values, we will encounter resistance. True values do not come to make us comfortable, but to challenge us. We know we are living our values when decisions become difficult, not easy. I once thought that when acting rightly, I would feel a sense of relief. But the truth is, every time I do the right thing, I often feel tired, because doing the right thing rarely brings victory. It only brings steadfastness and peace. Leonard Cohen once wrote, "Love is not a victory march, it's a cold and it's a broken hallelujah." I think that's true for values too. They are not brilliant, they are quiet. In an organization, the hardest thing is not defining values, but keeping them alive through every action when crises hit, when profits drop, when pressure builds. That's when values are tested by fire. A company can write accountability on the wall, but when things fall apart, who dares to say, "I take responsibility"? A team can hang a banner saying, "Trust each other." But if a small mistake leads to someone being blamed, that banner is no different from a drawing on glass. Values only exist when we act on them, even when no one is watching. I once asked a group of leaders, If your organization were forbidden to display value statements, would people still recognize what you believe in? They laughed, then fell silent. The answer lies there not in words, but in how others perceive us. If they feel safe, respected, encouraged, it means we are living by our values. If they feel fearful, cautious, it means we are only talking about values, not living with them. In this journey, I learned that there are no shortcuts to living authentically by our values. Every day we will be tested. Being honest when it's convenient is easy, but maintaining honesty when it costs us something precious, that is courage. Being fair when we are weak is simple, but remaining fair when we hold power, that is the challenge. Values are not what we say, they are what we are willing to pay for. Courage lies not in grand moments, but in small, daily decisions. Do you dare to speak the truth in a meeting? Do you dare to admit a mistake to others? Do you dare to acknowledge that you've strayed from what you believe? When we choose values over convenience, courage begins to take root. And when courage takes root, the smallest things can have the power to change an entire culture. The world doesn't need more declarations of values. The world needs people who dare to live fully by what they believe, even if no one applauds, even if the outcome isn't a sure win. Only by daring to act for our values do we truly know what we believe. And from that moment, values no longer reside on paper, but in the very way we show up in life. Authentic, steadfast, with a truly beating heart amidst the noisy crowd of the world. We must still step into our own arena. There are no gentle lights or cheering applause, only doubting glances, whispered judgments, and the pounding of our own heart as we must live authentically with what we believe. The arena is where values are tested, where beautiful words are forced to become actions, where courage cannot be faked. I call that the moment of entering the arena. Everyone has their own arena. The meeting where you have to say what no one wants to hear, the conversation with someone you've hurt, or even the moment you look in the mirror and admit you've strayed from the right path. No one can step in there for you, and no one can guarantee you won't get hurt. But what is certain is that if you don't venture in, you will betray yourself. In that arena, we often hear familiar voices from the stands. Not good enough. Who do you think you are to do that? They'll laugh in your face. I call them the voices of shame, comparison, scarcity, those who always have front row tickets. They sit there, patiently waiting for us to stumble, then whisper words that make us doubt our own worth. But I learned one thing: those voices don't disappear. We can only learn not to let them control us. I often tell leaders, choose carefully who gets a ticket to your arena. Not everyone deserves a place in our hearts. Reserve the first 2 seats for empathy and self-compassion. When we live by our values, those 2 seats are the only ones that help us stand firm. Empathy says, I understand this is difficult. Self-compassion says, I'm learning too. Both remind us that courage is not the absence of fear, but walking through fear. Empathy is the first thing forgotten when we are scared, and also the first thing that needs to be called back. It helps us see the person behind the action instead of just judging the outcome. I once witnessed a young manager dare to stand up and admit his mistake to the entire team. He said, I didn't listen enough, and that made everyone have to start over. The room went silent. No one laughed, no one criticized. They just nodded, because courage is always contagious. When one person dares to be honest, it opens up space for others to be authentic. Self-compassion is equally important. We are often harsher on ourselves than anyone else. When we fail, we replay condemning words in our heads that we would never say to another person. But if we cannot treat ourselves with kindness, we also cannot truly be kind to anyone else. I learned that self-compassion is not self-indulgence, but facing our mistakes without destroying ourselves because of them. That is the only way to learn and move forward. I once asked a group of leaders what they usually feel when facing difficult topics like privilege, prejudice, or discrimination. One person replied, I'm afraid I'll say the wrong thing. I said, if you stay silent, you are definitely wrong. Courageous leaders do not remain silent in the face of difficulty. They do not shy away from conversations about fairness. They dare to ask questions and listen even when there are no perfect answers. Because living by values is not just about protecting what is right for ourselves, but also about protecting what is right for others. In the arena, we must confront the privileged seats, those who have built the rules of the game to serve themselves. They say we are not enough, that opportunities have been allocated beforehand. But the truth is, courage doesn't wait for permission. We don't need recognition to live by our values. We just need to decide that silence is no longer an option. When we speak what others are afraid to say, when we ask questions no one dares to ask, we are changing not only our own story but also the atmosphere of the room. I once did a small experiment. Every time I had to face a difficult moment, I clicked my stopwatch and counted 8 seconds. Just 8 seconds of discomfort. That's the average time the strongest surge of courageous pain lasts. I call it the 8-second rule. If we can endure those 8 seconds, the worst is over. All that remains is the afterglow, the chance to breathe and stand firm. A soldier once told me, if I can endure 8 seconds of fear, I can do anything. I believe him, because in those 8 seconds, we choose between betraying our values and remaining loyal to them. Those who live authentically by their values don't always win, but they always find peace. They may be misunderstood, criticized, seen as naive or stubborn. But when night falls, they don't have to wonder if they have betrayed themselves. That is a silent but profound victory. I once ended a talk with the phrase, "Choose courage over comfort." A woman approached me, tears in her eyes, saying she had just dared to speak up to defend a colleague in a meeting, even though she knew her boss would be displeased. She said, "I was so scared, but when I spoke, I felt like myself again." I smiled, because that is the meaning of living by values, not to be praised, but not to lose oneself. True values do not come to make us comfortable but to challenge us. Every time we venture in, we not only demonstrate courage but also deepen the meaning of what we believe. And it is in difficult moments that values truly shine. Because if we only uphold values when everything is smooth, then that's not a value, it's just convenience. When we step out of the arena, we may be hurt, we may be tired, but one thing is certain: we will know we have lived. Because only by daring to be present amidst fear and uncertainty do we touch the deepest part of courage. And from there, we begin to live not to be safe, but to be real. Living by values cannot be separated from how we perceive and treat people. What we believe must be reflected in how we speak, how we listen, and especially how we give and receive feedback. If values remain only internal beliefs, they will be closed off like a stone in a pocket. But when we dare to turn them into action, they become the heartbeat that connects us to the world. Feedback is one of the biggest challenges of living by values, because speaking the truth is never easy. People often use the excuse, "I'm just being honest," to cover up cruelty. But honesty does not equate to hurting others. Truth spoken with anger or contempt is not courage, but emotional violence wrapped in logic. Someone can be factually correct, but wrong in the way they make others feel small. Truth has no value if it does not come with compassion. I always teach leadership teams to check themselves before speaking. I call it the authentic feedback checklist. If we want to tell someone something difficult, ask yourself, am I ready to sit asterisk beside asterisk them, not across from asterisk them? Because seating position reflects heart position. When we sit across, we are preparing for a battle. But when we sit beside, we are preparing for a dialogue. Feedback is not throwing stones, it is illuminating a problem together. Next, we need to ask ourselves, am I ready to place the problem in front of us asterisk, not between us? When the problem is between us, it becomes a wall. When it is in front of us, it becomes a map to find our way together. I've seen so many relationships break down because people forget this boundary. A statement like, "You are wrong," can be replaced with, "This is going off track. Let's review it together." It may sound small, but that change in language is a change in humanity. And we should only speak when we are ready to listen. Listening is an act of curiosity, not waiting to rebut. When we listen to react, we are closing doors. When we listen to understand, we are opening paths. I often tell my students, if you can't write down 3 things the other person does well before giving feedback, you're not ready to speak. Because respect begins with seeing the whole person, not just their mistakes. In my training sessions, I see many people tremble at feedback as if it were a punishment. But feedback, if practiced correctly, is an expression of trust. We only speak truthfully to someone we believe is strong enough to hear it. And we can only hear the truth when we believe the speaker doesn't want to hurt us. Feedback is the language of trust. Empathy is the conduit for feedback to flow where it needs to go. I call empathy humanity's connection circuit. It's not an innate skill, it's a skill that can be learned. When we know how to stand beside someone in their shame or pain and say, "I see you," we are giving them the most precious gift, the feeling of not being alone in a world full of noise. Just one person daring to listen genuinely is enough for someone to find themselves again. I once witnessed a young leader talking to an employee after a serious mistake. Instead of yelling, he just said, "This isn't good, but I know you're trying. I want to understand what happened because I've made mistakes like this too." That statement didn't diminish his authority. On the contrary, it made the entire team feel safe to learn. Courage is not pointing out others' faults, but creating a space where they dare to correct mistakes. To live by values, we must learn to see both the light and shadow in others and in ourselves. Everyone has moments of weakness and gets lost, but that doesn't make us less valuable. When we understand this, we can build relationships based on true trust, not on a facade of perfection. Trust is not built by vows, but by countless small, repeated actions every day. Sometimes living by values makes us tired. Doing the right thing doesn't always bring rewards. Sometimes it isolates us. But we must remember that values are not born for us to win against others, but for us to win against ourselves. Every time we choose courage over safety, choose honesty over comfort, we are nurturing what I call rooted confidence. That is the steadfastness that comes from knowing who you are, even if others don't yet understand. Rooted confidence is not noisy. It is the quietness of someone who no longer needs to prove themselves. It is built from countless times we have fallen and gotten back up, from difficult conversations we once avoided, from every time we chose connection instead of retreat. A leader once told me, "I feel lighter since I stopped trying to prove I'm not afraid." I replied, "Because you've started to be truly courageous." From then on, I understood that living by values is a journey with no destination. We just keep walking, keep learning, keep failing, and keep loving ourselves and others amidst the inevitable mess. Every day we will stand before the question, did I live by what I believe today? The answer doesn't need to be perfect, just honest. And when we answer yes, even just for a small moment in the day, the world changes a little. Because every action born of values is a reminder that people can still be good if they dare to choose what is right. That is the true foundation of courageous leadership. Not power, not position, but the ability to make others believe that kindness still exists. Trust is not born in a crisis. It is built from small, repeated actions, day after day. People only say, "Trust me," when everything has already started to crumble. But trust cannot be commanded. It doesn't appear when we need it, but is either present from the start or never there. Trust only exists when nurtured by the smallest actions. I always remember the image of the glass jar filled with small marbles, a simple yet profound metaphor. In every relationship, every good deed, every kept promise, every moment of sincere listening is a marble added to the jar. And likewise, every time we break a promise, lie, or ignore someone's feelings, it's a handful of marbles falling out in a day. But just one wrong action can make almost all of them fall. That's why trust is fragile but not invisible. It can be seen, counted, felt through every small behavior, through every time we choose kindness over convenience. When I started researching trust, I realized that people say, "I trust you," more than they understand. They think trust is an emotion, but it is actually a complex structure assembled from 7 pieces. I call it braving the anatomy of trust. Boundaries. Trust begins with knowing our limits and respecting the limits of others. We cannot trust someone if they violate our boundaries, just as we cannot trust ourselves if we don't know how to say no. Boundaries are not walls, they are fences of respect. Reliability. This is the foundation of every relationship. Reliability doesn't mean being able to do everything, but doing what you've promised. It requires the humility to recognize your own limits. Many people promise too much because they want to be liked, but that's precisely what makes them lose trust. Only when we can say, "I can't," will our promise, "I will," carry weight. See accountability. No one trusts someone who always blames others. Trust only exists among those who dare to say, "I was wrong." Admitting fault doesn't make us weak. It makes others feel safe to be honest too. Every time we apologize without defending ourselves, we add another marble to the jar. Confidentiality. Someone can make a whole room laugh by telling someone else's private story, but that laughter comes at the cost of a handful of marbles falling to the ground. Trustworthiness means knowing when to be silent, and more importantly, keeping secrets isn't just not talking about others' business, but also not sharing stories that aren't ours to tell. Trust dies when private stories become gossip. Integrity. Integrity doesn't come from pretending to be moral, but from choosing what is right over what is easy. In those fleeting moments between self-interest and righteousness, when no one knows, when no one praises, we still choose what is right. That's when integrity speaks. I've seen people uphold their values in situations where simply staying silent could have earned them a promotion. They weren't heroes, they were just people who knew what they didn't want to lose. N** on judgment. A healthy relationship is a place where we can ask for help without feeling ashamed. Paradoxically, people who dare to ask for help are often trusted more, not less. Because when they admit their limits, they allow others to step in, opening the door for two-way trust. Generosity. Trust does not exist among people who always doubt each other's intentions. Generosity in interpretation means we choose to see others in the best possible light instead of the darkness of fear. No one is perfect, but if we believe they are trying, instead of assuming they are being malicious, we are giving them a chance to be better. I call braving the unlock formula for trust, but in reality, it's just a way to name things everyone knows but few practice. In the organizations I've visited, I've seen trust crumble not because of major betrayals, but because of a series of overlooked small details. A broken promise, an unanswered email, a meeting where the leader didn't dare to admit they were wrong. Trust collapses millimeter by millimeter, not all at once. When we understand braving, we realize that trust is no longer something emotional. It is a sequence of concrete actions that we can teach, measure, and practice. We can ask, "What makes you trust me?" And then we will hear answers that are heartbreakingly simple. Because you listen to me, because you keep my secrets, because you do what you say. No one says, because you're talented. Because talent only makes others admire you, not trust you. Every day we have an opportunity to add a marble to someone's jar or our own. Trust doesn't require grand declarations. It only needs a silent, repeated sequence of small actions. When we live by what we say, when we respect boundaries, when we choose courage over ease, we are saying, "You can trust me." And that, over time, becomes a bond stronger than any promise. Braving is the map of trust, and each action within it is a small marble that we can personally place in the jar every day. The only question left is, today, are we adding marbles or dropping them without knowing? Trust in an organization cannot be measured by vague emotions. It needs a specific language, something visible, something that can be practiced every day. After years of working with different teams, I realized that when people have a common language to talk about trust, they are no longer afraid of dialogue. Braving is that tool, the way to transform trust from an emotion into a structure. I often start workshops with a simple exercise. Everyone writes down, according to the 7 elements of braving, what they need from colleagues to feel trusted and what they can do to make others trust them. When they read them aloud, the room becomes unusually quiet. Things that seemed obvious suddenly become clear. I need you to be direct when you disagree. I need you to keep your word when you promise something. I need to be trusted that my mistakes don't define me. No one talks about salary, power, or position. They only talk about the feeling of safety to be themselves. I encourage them to share these lists with each other, not to control, but to jointly create team expectations. When everyone understands what they need to trust each other, conflicts become easier to discuss because there is a language for it. Trust is no longer a vague emotion but a measurable structure. A leader from the Jessing Foundation told me that in her organization, every act of fairness, transparency, and accountability is a marble added to the collective jar. But when someone betrays trust, it's not just one marble lost, but a large handful withdrawn. She was right. Loss of trust rarely comes from a single action. It's the result of a series of small, uncorrected behaviors. And when a leader doesn't dare to admit mistakes, the whole team starts learning to hide errors instead of correcting them. In every trust system, integrity and generosity are the 2 biggest pillars. Integrity is when we choose what is right over what is easy. In a world where profit and speed are glorified, choosing integrity is an act of courage. It requires us to pause and ask ourselves, am I acting in alignment with the values I preach? I've seen leaders who don't need to shout about integrity, but just one of their statements can make the whole team self-reflect. Integrity is contagious, but it starts with one person daring to choose what is right when no one is watching. And generosity, this is the least talked about part of trust, yet it determines how people interpret each other's intentions. When we choose to assume good intent in others, we are sowing seeds of trust. Someone who is late might be irresponsible, or their child might have been sick this morning. The facts don't change, but our assumption changes the entire atmosphere. Generosity in thought doesn't make us naive. It makes us strong because we don't let fear control how we see others. I call the combination of three elements: boundaries, integrity, and generosity big. A person with clear boundaries, integrity in their actions, and generosity in their thoughts is someone who can sustain trust the longest. No one can be truly generous without boundaries, because if we let others cross the line, kindness will turn into resentment. Nor can boundaries be strong without integrity, because we will bend ourselves to please others. And without generosity, boundaries become walls, no longer doors of respect. I once saw a company that wrote trust as a core value on all its communication materials, but didn't teach its employees how to live by that value. When I asked them, "What does trust mean here?" the room fell silent. One person said, "It means trusting the leadership." I asked, "And who does the leadership trust?" No one answered. An organization cannot operate on one-way trust. If you only demand that subordinates trust you without creating space for them to be trusted, that trust is just an empty slogan. The braving inventory helps us turn slogans into action. When the whole team can say, "I need clearer boundaries. I need to know you will take responsibility if something goes wrong. I want to trust that you don't talk about me when I'm absent." These statements are no longer complaints, but the beginning of building. I have witnessed teams that seem to be falling apart rediscover their cohesion simply by daring to say these things. Trust is not built by command, but by silent, repeated actions. It doesn't need drums or slogans plastered on walls. It is nurtured by how a leader looks at their employees, by how a colleague keeps a small promise, by non-judgmental listening in a short conversation. Trust is created when we're not paying attention, but lost the moment we forget it needs to be protected. When we know how to name trust, we can teach others how to build and maintain it. And when the entire team shares the braving language, every meeting, every debate, every difficult decision becomes an opportunity to add marbles to the common jar. Trust is no longer something we hope for, but something we know how to create. Trusting others begins with knowing how to trust ourselves. This is what most people overlook. They want others to trust them but cannot keep small commitments to themselves. No one can give others what they themselves do not possess. To build trust, one must first learn to self-trust. I often ask workshop participants, "Do you trust yourself?" They nod. Then I ask, "When you promise yourself you'll rest, do you actually rest? When you say you won't let others cross your boundaries, do you keep your word?" At that point, they fall silent because they realize they too have betrayed themselves many times through seemingly small actions. Self-trust is applying braving to yourself. I ask myself, do I keep my boundaries, or do I still allow others to take up all my time and energy? Am I reliable? Do I do what I promised myself? Do I dare to take responsibility for my mistakes, or do I find reasons to forgive myself too easily? Do I keep the secrets of others and my own, or do I still tell them to seek attention? Do I live with integrity, choosing what is right over what is easy, even when no one knows? Do I dare to look at myself without judgment and treat myself with generosity when I stumble? Each question is a mirror, reflecting how I build or break the glass jar of internal trust. After falls, we often lose trust in ourselves before losing trust in others. We say, "I know I won't do that again." Then we do. We promise ourselves, "Next time will be different." Then we forget. Each time, a handful of marbles falls from the jar not because we are bad, but because we haven't learned how to start over. Restoring self-trust doesn't come from slogans, but from small, achievable commitments. It could be going to bed on time, daring to say no when necessary, or simply completing one thing you promised yourself. When we do that, the first marble is dropped back into the jar, and then others will follow. I remember the first time, after a major failure, I asked myself if I could ever trust myself again. The answer didn't come immediately, but I started with small things. Every morning, I wrote down 3 things I wanted to stick to that day, not grand goals, but very specific things. Don't check my phone before breakfast. Don't agree to a project I know I can't handle. And don't let anyone tell me my feelings are irrational. Each day that passed, I felt a little stronger, not because I achieved everything, but because I kept a part of my promise to myself. Trust doesn't return with one big victory, but with a series of small, silent victories. In this journey, I learned a new concept of generosity. generosity with oneself. When we fail, we often say things to ourselves that we would never dare to say to others. You're so stupid, you'll never change. But if we can speak to ourselves with the voice of a friend instead of a judge, we will see strength return. Self-compassion doesn't make us weak. It helps us learn the lesson that shame always tries to hide. I once met a woman who had lost all trust after being betrayed at work. She said, "I don't trust anyone anymore, not even myself." We started with an exercise. Every day she had to write down 3 things she had done right, no matter how small. After a few weeks, she said, "I'm starting to believe that I can still be trusted." That trust was not magic, but the result of continuously practicing braving with herself. A crucial part of self-trust is daring to take responsibility when we hurt others, but also not turning mistakes into a lifelong sentence. We apologize, we make amends, and then we move on. Because if we dwell in regret, we are losing the opportunity for others to trust us again. Trust doesn't demand perfection, it demands consistency. When applying braving to ourselves, we realize that trust is a two-way street. The more we understand ourselves, the easier it is to understand others. The more we learn to keep our word to ourselves, the more we understand the value of others' promises to us. The more we learn to forgive ourselves, the more we learn to forgive others. And then we realize we cannot demand the world to do what we ourselves don't dare to do. I once told a group of leaders, if you want others to trust you, start by trusting yourself. Someone asked, "What if I can't trust myself yet?" I replied, "Then start by doing one small thing you can trust. Trust is not an emotion, it is an action. When we act in alignment with what we say, trust arises naturally, gently yet firmly." Finally, I realized that trust in others and in oneself is nurtured by the same principle, the patient repetition of value-aligned behavior. And when we have learned to trust ourselves, we are no longer afraid to get back up after failure. Because we know that no matter how many times we fall, the jar of trust within us can be refilled, one marble at a time. When we dare to trust ourselves, the world begins to trust us. The most frightening thing is not failure, but living a life without ever truly showing up. We build for ourselves a sturdy shell of reason, of roles, of proper smiles, only to realize that when no one is watching, we are exhausted in that very armor. This book doesn't teach us how to be perfect. It only asks a simple question: do we dare to courageously live with our raw hearts? The most important lesson lies in the paradox that everyone fears to look at. Courage is not the absence of fear, but carrying fear with you and still moving forward. Leadership is not a position, but the behavior of someone who dares to take responsibility for their own potential and that of others. In a world where everyone competes not to be hurt, the one who dares to accept vulnerability is the freest. Because only by daring to fall do we know how far we can rise. When we learn to face vulnerability, we stop avoiding the true self within us. When we live by our values, we stop needing external validation to know we are valuable. When we build trust, we stop controlling others to maintain connection with them. And when we trust ourselves, we stop needing the world to tell us we are good enough. Courage, ultimately, is not an outward action, but an inward journey where we dare to look directly at our weakest parts without running away. If there is one thing I want to leave you with, it is an invitation. Try to be silent for a moment and ask yourself, when no one is watching, am I still living by what I believe? If the answer is no, then that very moment is the starting point. We don't need to change the whole world, we just need to change how we show up in that world. Perhaps it's listening for one more minute, speaking truthfully even if your voice trembles, keeping the smallest promise, or daring to say, "I don't know." Every small action is a brick building courage. Think about the glass jar within us, holding trust, integrity, kindness. Every day we have an opportunity to add a marble to it, or to let a large handful fall out. No one else decides that but us. And perhaps true growth is not about becoming stronger, but about knowing how to keep that jar full, no matter how much the world outside crumbles. So what about you? Are you adding marbles to the jar, or letting them fall out little by little? Are you living by what you believe, or just living in the easiest way possible? And if tomorrow the world falls silent, with only the sound of your own heart beating, would you hear within it a growing rhythm of courage? Perhaps we will never know the exact answer, but the mere act of daring to ask is the first step of courage. Because a heart that dares to ask questions means it is still alive, still hopeful, and still wants to be truer than yesterday. Start there. Show up with all your imperfections. Because this world doesn't need more strong people. It needs people who dare to be vulnerable and still move forward, daring to be courageous, daring to live, daring to be themselves.